June 14th, 1944, the dense hedgerows of Normandy's bocage country, Private First Class Daniel Reeves pressed his cheek against the cool earth, his breath shallow as sweat trickled down his temple. Through his scope, he could see the German panzer commander barely visible as he surveyed the battlefield from his partially open hatch. The tank's massive form was mostly concealed behind a thick hedgerow, presenting only the turret and commander for a brief moment. Standard sniper doctrine said to wait for a better shot or to avoid engaging armor entirely. His commanding officer had explicitly ordered all snipers to focus on infantry targets only. Tanks were for the tank destroyers and bazooka teams. But Daniel had counted 7 American Sherman tanks destroyed along this road since dawn, 7 crews of 5 men each, 35 lives, and from his elevated position in an abandoned farmhouse attic, he could see what the Sherman crews could not. 3 more Panzers waiting in ambush just around the bend. His radio crackled with orders. All sniper teams maintain focus on infantry support. Leave armor to the TDs. Repeat, do not engage armor. Daniel's spotter, Corporal Frank Kowalski, glanced at him nervously. Orders are orders, Danny. Daniel's hand trembled slightly as he reached down to the small tin cup beside him filled with muddy water he had collected earlier. The morning sun caught the surface of the murky liquid, reflecting a perfect blinding flash toward the hedgerow where the tank commander stood partially exposed. The German officer squinted momentarily, distracted by the unexpected glint of light. In that instant, Daniel knew disobeying direct orders could end his military career or save dozens of American lives advancing up the road below. His finger tightened on the trigger. This is the story of how 19 Panzer commanders vanished in a single day, how a tin cup of muddy water became the most effective anti-armor weapon in Normandy, and how one farm boy from Nebraska changed warfare forever by understanding something the military manual never taught. Light moves faster than orders. Daniel Reeves had grown up in rural Nebraska, the third son of a wheat farmer who had served briefly in the Great War. His childhood was defined by vast open skies and the patient work of tending fields alongside his father and brothers. What distinguished young Daniel from his siblings was his extraordinary eyesight and steady hands gifts that made him an exceptional hunter from an early age. By 12, he was responsible for putting meat on the family table during the hardest years of the Depression, able to hit a rabbit at distances that impressed even his father's old war buddies who visited occasionally. When his mother Sarah died during childbirth in 1928, Daniel was only 8 years old. The baby a sister he would never know died too. His father, John, already struggling with shrapnel wounds from the Argonne Forest that left him with a permanent limp, now faced raising 3 boys alone. Then came 1929. The stock market crashed. The sky turned black with topsoil. Hope became as scarce as rain across the Nebraska plains. By 1932, the Reeves family faced starvation. Daniel's older brother James had left to work the rail lines 3 counties away, sending home what little money he could. John's war injury had worsened. Some days he could barely walk the fields, let alone work them. Young Tommy was only 5 too small to help with anything beyond feeding chickens. That left Daniel, 12 years old and solely responsible for keeping his family fed. The wheat crop had failed 2 years running. They had no money for store-bought meat. The general store in North Platte extended credit only so far. So Daniel took his father's old Winchester rifle, the same rifle John had learned to shoot with as a boy before the Great War, took him to France and went hunting. Miss your shot, your family went hungry that night. There was no room for error, no second chances. Every bullet counted because bullets cost money they didn't have. Daniel learned quickly, not just marksmanship, but observation. He learned to read the land, to understand how animals move through tall grass, to anticipate behavior patterns, but most importantly, he learned something that would save his life 12 years later in France. He learned how light works. Prairie dawn in Nebraska creates specific conditions. The sun rises low and harsh across flat land. It reflects off dewdrops clinging to grass stems. It creates mirages in summer heat. It blinds and reveals and deceives all at once. Daniel discovered that wounded deer would hide in shadow, thinking darkness protected them. But if he positioned himself correctly, if he waited for the exact moment when the sun hit the dew on the grass just right, the reflection would momentarily blind the animal. They would raise their heads, confused by the sudden flash of light cutting through the dawn. And in that moment of disorientation, in that brief window, when instinct overcame caution, Daniel had his shot. His father witnessed it once. Daniel tracking a wounded buck for 3 days through November cold, finally taking what John estimated as a 400-yard shot right at dawn when reflected sunlight off a frozen puddle caught the animal's attention. At the exact moment Daniel squeezed the trigger. Son John had said quietly that morning, "You don't just see light. You understand it. That's a rare gift." Daniel didn't think of it as a gift. He thought of it as necessity. His family needed to eat. Light was a tool like the rifle or the knife. Use every advantage available, waste nothing, survive. By 1938, the worst of the Depression had eased. Daniel, now 18, found work at the local hardware store, earning 40 cents an hour. He still hunted in the early mornings before work, old habits dying hard, but the family wasn't starving anymore. James had returned home after his railroad work ended. Tommy was 11, finally old enough to help with serious farm chores. Life had achieved a certain stability. Daniel had even started courting Ellen Hartley, the daughter of the man who owned the feed store in town. They talked about marriage, about Daniel maybe taking over the hardware store someday, about building a life in North Platte like generations of Reeves before them. Then came December 7th, 1941. Daniel was closing the hardware store when the news came over the radio. Pearl Harbor, Japanese attack, thousands of Americans dead. The voice of the announcer shook with rage and disbelief. President Roosevelt would address Congress tomorrow. War was coming. Daniel was 21 years old. He had spent his entire life within 200 miles of where he was born. He knew wheat farming and hardware retail and how to shoot rabbits at distances most men couldn't see clearly. He had never been on a train, never seen the ocean, never fired a shot in anger. On December 8th, 1941, Daniel Reeves walked into the Army recruitment office in North Platte and enlisted in the United States Army. He was the first man in his county to do so. His father said little at the family dinner that night. But before Daniel went to bed, John pressed something into his hand. A small mirror cracked down the middle, the glass still held together by the metal frame. "This was my trench periscope mirror," John said quietly. "Argonne Forest, 1918. German shrapnel hit it instead of my face. Still works. Kept me alive. Brought me home." His father's calloused hand closed around Daniel's. "Bring it back to me, son. Bring yourself back." Daniel kept that cracked mirror in his pocket through basic training at Fort Benning, through the Atlantic Crossing in January 1944, through the cold English winter, preparing for something the officers called Operation Overlord. The mirror became a talisman, a connection to home, a promise he intended to keep. But more than that, it would become a weapon. One his father could never have imagined. Fort Benning, Georgia, March 1942. Basic training revealed what Daniel already knew. He could shoot, but the Army had thousands of men who could shoot. They needed men who could shoot precisely under impossible conditions while someone was actively trying to kill them. During a routine range qualification, Daniel fired a perfect score using only iron sights. Most men celebrated hitting targets at 200 yards. Daniel was grouping shots at 400 yards like he was shooting tin cans off a fence post back home. Lieutenant Raymond Costa, a former competitive shooter from Boston with trophies and newspaper clippings to prove it, watched Daniel during qualification week. What caught his attention wasn't just accuracy, it was timing. Most recruits shot when conditions were ideal. Mid-morning light, clear skies, minimal wind. Daniel deliberately chose dawn and dusk time slots when light was most difficult and most men struggled to see their targets clearly. Private Reeves Costa approached him after the 5th consecutive perfect score. "Why do you shoot in the worst light conditions?" Daniel shouldered his rifle, standing at attention. "Because that's when prey moves, sir. When they think shadow protects them. If you can only shoot when conditions are perfect, you can only hunt half the day." Costa studied this quiet farm boy who spoke about warfare like hunting deer across Nebraska grasslands. "How long have you been shooting?" "Since I was 8, sir." "Had to." Family needed to eat during the Depression. How far? Daniel hesitated. "How far? What, sir? How far can you reliably hit a target? On the Nebraska plains with my father's Winchester, I took a deer at 400 yards once. Maybe a bit more. Wind makes it harder, but if you understand how light moves, you can usually compensate." Lieutenant Costa made a note in his file. 2 weeks later, Daniel received new orders. Report to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina for specialized sniper training. Only 5% of qualified marksmen received this assignment. The training was unlike anything Daniel had experienced. They taught windage calculations, mathematical formulas for bullet drop at various distances. They taught elevation adjustments, the ballistic performance of the M1903 Springfield A4 rifle with its inertial 8-power scope. They taught breathing control, how to slow your heartbeat before taking a shot, trigger discipline, the difference between pulling and squeezing, concealment techniques, stalking methods, observation skills, but they also taught doctrine, rigid, specific, proven doctrine developed over decades of military experience, written in blood and hard lessons. Snipers target infantry, officers first, radio operators second, machine gunners third. Snipers do not engage armored vehicles, that's for anti-tank teams. Snipers follow orders, improvisation gets people killed. The manual was 47 pages of proven techniques refined through the Great War and updated with lessons from the Spanish Civil War. Deviation from the manual was actively discouraged. Daniel understood the reasoning. In military operations, consistency saves lives. Everyone following the same procedures creates predictability. Predictability enables coordination. Coordination wins battles. He respected that logic. He studied the manual, diligently memorizing every page. But something bothered him. The manual assumed certain battlefield conditions. It assumed snipers would have clear lines of sight, identifiable targets, and time to coordinate with supporting elements. What if those conditions didn't exist? What if the terrain or situation demanded adaptation? He kept these thoughts to himself. But in the pre-dawn hours before training began, Daniel conducted experiments the manual didn't mention. Camp Lejeune, summer 1943. Daniel's fellow trainees came from diverse backgrounds. Many were competitive shooters from urban areas, men from Philadelphia and Chicago and Los Angeles who had won trophies, who understood ballistics theory from books, who could recite manual specifications from memory. They were good, technically proficient, confident in their abilities. They nicknamed him Farm Boy, not with particular malice, just the casual dismissiveness city people sometimes showed toward rural folk who talked slowly and didn't have much formal education. Hey, Farm Boy, one trainee named Harrison from Philadelphia would joke during mess hall, how to read that fancy scope. It's not like shooting rabbits in a cornfield. Daniel said little. He had learned early that talking didn't prove anything. Results did. But in private moments before dawn, while other men slept, Daniel conducted experiments the manual didn't mention. He had noticed something during training. When instructors demonstrated long-range shooting, they always positioned themselves optimally. Perfect light, ideal angles, minimal glare in the scope. But warfare wasn't optimal. Warfare was chaos and confusion and situations the manual never anticipated. So Daniel started testing what happened when conditions weren't perfect. He would fill his canteen with different water consistencies: clear water, slightly muddy water, very muddy water with clay mixed in. He practiced with his father's cracked mirror, testing reflection angles at different times of day. He observed how light moved across the North Carolina landscape, how it reflected off various surfaces, how it could blind or reveal or deceive. He discovered that muddy water created a diffuse reflection that was harder to pinpoint than a clear mirror flash. The clay particles suspended in the liquid scattered light in ways that drew attention without revealing exact source location. He was testing whether light itself could become a tactical tool, a way to create shooting opportunities where none existed. One morning, Corporal Frank Kowalski, a loud and gregarious 19-year-old Polish-American kid from Pittsburgh's steel mills, caught Daniel practicing with a tin cup of water, carefully angling it to catch the sunrise and direct reflected light toward a target 200 yards away. Farm boy, what the hell are you doing? Kowalski asked, genuinely confused. Daniel hesitated, testing something. Testing how to signal enemy planes, testing if reflected light can distract a target long enough to create a shooting opportunity. Kowalski stared at him like he had suggested using a slingshot against a tank. That's not in the manual, I know. The instructors would call that trick shooting. They would tell you to stick to proven techniques. Daniel nodded slowly. Probably. So why do it? Daniel looked at the younger man. Kowalski was 19, enthusiastic, full of energy and confidence. He had never gone hungry a day in his life. His father made good money at the steel mill. Frank had grown up with 3 meals a day and new clothes every year. How could Daniel explain that depression survival meant using every advantage that manuals were written by people who had never had to choose between missing a shot and watching their family starve? Because someday, Daniel said quietly, the manual won't be enough. Someday we'll face a situation doctrine didn't prepare us for. And when that happens, I want options. Kowalski considered this. Show me. So Daniel demonstrated how angling a reflective surface could create a brief flash that drew attention, how muddy water created a diffuse glow that was harder to pinpoint than a clear mirror reflection, how timing the light flash with a shot could give you a 2-second window of distraction. 2 seconds didn't sound like much, but 2 seconds was enough for an enemy to raise his head, to stand a bit taller, to expose himself just enough. That's actually brilliant, Kowalski admitted, his dismissive attitude shifting to genuine respect. You should show the instructors. They might add it to the training. No, Daniel said firmly. Why not? Because they'll tell me to stop. They'll say it's not proven, not documented, not in the manual. They'll say it's trick shooting and stage magic and not proper military technique. Better to just know how to do it and keep quiet. Fair enough, Kowalski said. Then with a grin, hey, farm boy, you're smarter than you look. Thanks, I think. A week later, during a live fire exercise, Kowalski's rifle malfunctioned catastrophically. A squib load, a bullet that didn't fully exit the barrel. Kowalski, not realizing the problem, chambered another round and prepared to fire. The barrel was obstructed. Firing again would cause the rifle to explode. Daniel had been positioned 15 feet away, observing the range. He saw Kowalski pull the trigger the first time, saw the unusual recoil, saw Kowalski's confusion. In the split second before Kowalski could chamber another round and fire again, Daniel launched himself across the distance and tackled the younger man sideways off the firing line. The rifle exploded anyway. The barrel ruptured, sending shrapnel through the space where Kowalski's face had been 3 seconds earlier. The explosion knocked both men down. Kowalski hit his head on a rock and lost consciousness. Daniel's quick reaction saved the younger man's life, though Kowalski spent 3 days unconscious with a severe concussion, and everyone thought he might not wake up. When Kowalski finally opened his eyes in the infirmary, the first thing he saw was Daniel sitting beside his bed, still in his training uniform, looking exhausted. You saved my life, Kowalski said, his voice hoarse. You would have done the same, Daniel replied quietly. No, I mean it. You didn't have to. You could have been hurt. The rifle could have killed you too. Why did you do it? Daniel shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. Because you're worth saving, Frank. From that moment, Frank Kowalski decided his life belonged to Daniel Reeves. Whatever Daniel did, wherever Daniel went, whatever risks Daniel took, Kowalski would be there. He owed the farm boy from Nebraska everything, and Frank Kowalski always paid his debts. 2 weeks before their graduation from sniper school, Captain Charles Holloway caught Daniel conducting his unauthorized reflection experiments during the pre-dawn hours. Holloway was a career soldier, 20 years in the Army, a veteran of the Great War who had helped write portions of the current sniper manual. He was respected, experienced, and not a man who tolerated deviation from proven doctrine. Private Reeves Holloway's voice cut through the darkness like a knife. What exactly are you doing? Daniel immediately stood at attention. Practicing observation techniques, sir. With a tin cup of muddy water. Yes, sir. That's not in the curriculum. No, sir. Captain Holloway approached, slowly examining the setup. The tin cup positioned to catch sunrise, the angle calculated to direct reflected light toward a distant target, Daniel's position relative to the sun and the target. Holloway was no fool. He understood immediately what Daniel was attempting. You're testing reflection as a distraction technique, Holloway observed, his voice neutral. Yes, sir. Why Daniel hesitated. Explaining his reasoning to an officer who had literally written portions of the sniper manual felt presumptuous, maybe even insulting. But Holloway was waiting for an answer, and Daniel had learned that honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, was usually the right choice. Sir, the manual assumes we'll have ideal conditions, clear lines of sight, identifiable targets, time to coordinate with support elements. But what if terrain limits visibility? What if targets are partially concealed? What if we need to create an advantage rather than wait for one? Holloway listened without interrupting, his weathered face, unreadable in the growing dawn light. Light moves faster than human reaction time, Sir Daniel continued, gaining confidence. If I can create a momentary distraction, a flash of light that draws attention or briefly blinds, that gives me maybe 2 seconds before the target processes what happened. 2 seconds is enough for a shot. This isn't sniper doctrine, Reeves. This is trick shooting. Stage magic. The Army doesn't win wars with parlor tricks. No, Sir Daniel said carefully. The Army wins wars by adapting to circumstances the enemy doesn't expect. The words hung in the dawn air between them. Daniel immediately realized he had crossed a line. You didn't lecture a captain about winning wars when you were a private first-class farm boy from Nebraska with dirt still under your fingernails, but Captain Holloway didn't reprimand him. Instead, after a long silence, Holloway said something Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. Private Reeves, you have excellent instincts and exceptional skill, but the manual exists for a reason. It's written in the blood of men who learned through hard experience what works and what gets people killed. Deviation from proven doctrine is dangerous, not just for you, but for every man in your unit who depends on you following procedure. Holloway paused, studying Daniel's face. However, I won't order you to stop these experiments. I'll simply say this. If your improvisation ever compromises a mission or endangers your unit, I will personally ensure you're court-martialed. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. Dismissed. Daniel returned to his barracks, knowing he had received both a warning and something stranger. Permission. Holloway hadn't ordered him to stop. He had only warned of consequences. That meant somewhere in Captain Holloway's experienced mind, he understood that the manual wouldn't cover every battlefield situation. He just wasn't allowed to say it officially. Frank Kowalski found Daniel an hour later. Did Holloway bust you? No. He told me deviation from doctrine is dangerous. Then he didn't order me to stop. What does that mean? It means, Daniel said slowly, that somewhere in Captain Holloway's mind, he knows the manual won't cover everything we're going to face. He's just not allowed to admit it. 3 weeks later, in January 1944, Daniel and Frank shipped out to England, assigned to the 29th Infantry Division, 175th Infantry Regiment. The Blue and Gray Division men from Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania, preparing for something the officers called Operation Overlord. Nobody told them exactly what Overlord meant, but the intensity of training increased dramatically. Beach assault tactics, urban combat, house-to-house fighting, and one afternoon, a brief and woefully inadequate session on something called hedgerow terrain. The instructors showed them photographs of the Norman bocage, ancient field boundaries topped with dense vegetation and centuries-old trees. If we push inland from the beaches, one lieutenant explained casually, we might encounter this type of terrain. It will limit visibility and provide concealment for German defenders. Stay alert, coordinate with your infantry units, and follow standard procedures, the manual, proven doctrine that had worked in North Africa and Italy and would surely work in France. Daniel studied those photographs and felt a cold unease settle in his stomach. Those hedgerows looked like perfect concealment for armor, natural revetments where tanks could hide hull down, only their turrets visible. Limited visibility would make coordination nearly impossible. Standard procedures might fail completely in terrain like that. He began practicing his reflection techniques with renewed urgency, now imagining scenarios where German tanks used those hedgerows for ambush positions. Frank kept watch while Daniel experimented with different mud consistencies, different angles of reflection, different timing sequences. Other soldiers thought they were crazy wasting time on something that wasn't in the manual. You really think you'll need this? Frank asked one Cold morning in March 1944, his breath visible in the air. Daniel adjusted his tin cup, catching the weak English sunrise. I think he said quietly that when we get to France, the manual is going to fail us, and when it does, I want to be ready. He had no idea how soon those words would prove prophetic. D-Day +1, June 7, 1944. Daniel Reeves arrived at Omaha Beach 24 hours after the initial assault waves. The main fighting had moved inland, but the beach itself remained a scene of devastation that no amount of training could have prepared him for. Bodies still floated in the surf, rolling with each wave. Burned-out Sherman tanks littered the sand like abandoned toys. Medics worked frantically on wounded men, their hands red to the elbows. The smell of burning metal mixed with cordite and death created a stench that would live in Daniel's memory forever. Frank Kowalski vomited twice before they made it off the beach. Other men looked away embarrassed, but Daniel put a hand on his friend's shoulder. Manual didn't cover this, Frank muttered, wiping his mouth with a shaking hand. No, Daniel agreed quietly. It didn't. The 29th Infantry Division's mission was to push inland towards St. Lo, a crucial road junction about 30 miles from the coast. Capturing St. Lo would enable the Allied breakout from Normandy, allowing American forces to sweep across France toward Germany. But between the beaches and St. Lo lay the bocage, those ancient hedgerows that looked infinitely worse in reality than any photograph had suggested. Each field was a separate fortress. Each hedgerow was a 15-foot-tall earthen mound topped with centuries-old oak and elm trees, their roots creating an impenetrable tangle. Vegetation so dense that visibility dropped to less than 100 yards. The Norman farmers had been building these field boundaries since Roman times, never imagining they would become the perfect defensive terrain for a retreating German army. Standard American tactics developed in the open terrain of North Africa failed immediately and catastrophically. The first week of combat in the bocage, June 8th through 13th, taught Daniel Reeves exactly why the manual wasn't enough, why sometimes doctrine had to be abandoned, why survival required seeing what others missed. June 9th. Daniel and Frank provided overwatch for Charlie Company's advance along a narrow dirt road between hedgerows, standard sniper mission. Observe enemy positions, identify high-value targets, eliminate threats, call in armor or artillery as needed. Daniel spotted 2 German Panzer IV tanks positioned hull down behind distant hedgerows. Only their turrets were visible above the vegetation, guns trained on the road where American Shermans would soon advance. Perfect ambush positions. The American tankers would never see the threat until it was too late. Daniel immediately called it in. Charlie 6, this is Overwatch 2. Enemy armor confirmed. 2 Panzer IVs in ambush positions. Grid coordinates Delta 3-8. Recommend tank destroyer support before advancing our armor. Over. Overwatch 2, information received. Continue mission. Out. But nothing happened. No tank destroyers arrived. No orders came to halt the American advance. The communication had been received, logged, and apparently ignored or lost in the chaos of battlefield coordination. Daniel watched helplessly as 2 American Sherman tanks rolled unsuspecting up that narrow road, their crews visible through open hatches, young men laughing about something completely unaware. They had 30 seconds to live. The German panzers fired simultaneously. 2 Sherman tanks destroyed in 45 seconds, 10 American tankers dead or burning alive in steel coffins. The 3rd Sherman, suddenly understanding the threat, reversed frantically and escaped, but 10 men were already gone. Frank Kowalski's hands shook as he lowered his binoculars, his face pale. We called it in, Danny. We did our job. We followed procedure. It's not our fault they didn't listen. But Daniel kept thinking about what he had seen just before the panzers fired. The German tank commanders standing partially exposed in their hatches, directing their gunners toward targets. Exposed for maybe 5 seconds. 5 seconds where Daniel had a clear shot. 5 seconds where he could have eliminated both commanders and prevented the ambush. Orders say snipers don't engage armor, Frank reminded him quietly. That's doctrine, Danny. That's the manual. Daniel said nothing, but something inside him had shifted. 10 Americans were dead. He had seen the threat. He had the skill to stop it. But doctrine said armor wasn't his responsibility. What good was doctrine if following it meant watching men die when you could have saved them June 10th? Baker Company, Daniel, and Frank's assigned unit attempted to take a single hedgerow-bounded field. German defenders used the terrain perfectly, machine gun nests interlocking, mortars pre-registered on choke points, and 1 Panther tank hidden so effectively that American forces didn't spot it until it fired. The Panther destroyed 1 Sherman, disabled another, and raked the advancing infantry with machine gun fire. Baker Company took 30% casualties before withdrawing. The Panther withdrew unscathed. Daniel had spotted the Panther's commander twice during the engagement. Partially visible, maybe 3 seconds of exposure, too quick for coordination with anti-tank teams, but not too quick for a sniper shot, if he'd taken it, if he'd violated orders. June 11th. Daniel watched a German Panzer IV commander direct his crew through a treacherous gap between hedgerows. The commander was necessarily exposed, standing half out of the hatch, guiding his driver through the narrow passage. Perfect target, 800 yards, minimal wind, clean shot. Daniel's finger moved to the trigger guard. Frank noticed. Danny don't. Orders are explicit. You engage armor, they'll court-martial you. If I don't engage, that Panzer will kill Americans. That's someone else's responsibility, not yours. Daniel watched the Panzer commander complete his maneuver and button up, safe, alive, ready to kill more American soldiers. 2 hours later, that same Panzer ambushed a supply convoy. 12 Americans killed. Daniel said nothing that evening, but Frank saw him cleaning his rifle with unusual intensity, jaw-tight hands, precise. June 12th. Battalion briefing. The division commander's message filtered down: tank losses were unsustainable. The Bocage breakthrough had stalled. New tactics were needed, but what tactics? The manual had no answers for this terrain. Tank destroyers couldn't coordinate effectively when visibility was measured in yards. Bazooka teams couldn't get close enough through the compartmentalized fields. Air support couldn't identify targets through the canopy. German panzer units operated with near impunity, using the hedgerows as perfect concealment for devastating ambush tactics. Captain William Hayes addressed the sniper teams after the briefing. I know you've been spotting armor. Keep calling it in, but remember your job is infantry support. Officers, radio operators, machine gunners, leave armor to the specialists. That's how we win. Everyone doing their assigned job. Clear, clear, Sir Daniel responded along with the others. But that night, lying in his foxhole under the Norman stars, Daniel made a decision. He didn't tell Frank. He barely admitted it to himself, but he made it nonetheless. The next time he had a clear shot at a German tank commander orders or no orders doctrine or no doctrine, he was taking it, because 14 Sherman tanks had burned in 5 days, 104 American tankers dead or wounded, and Daniel Reeves had counted every single one. He pulled out the letter he'd started writing to Ellen 3 days earlier but hadn't finished. By candlelight, hands shaking slightly, he wrote, "Dear Ellen, they taught us to follow orders, and I've always been good at that. But out here, sometimes following orders means watching good men die when you could have stopped it. What do you do when doing the right thing means disobeying everything they taught you?" I keep thinking about Dad's stories from the Argonne, how he said war isn't about the manual, it's about coming home. All I know is if I can see a threat that'll kill a dozen Americans and I have the shot, I'm not sure I can just watch it happen because someone said, "Armor isn't my job, I love you, I'll come home, I promise." Daniel, he sealed the letter, lit a cigarette, and began preparing for the next day's mission. Tomorrow was June 14th, 1944. Tomorrow, Daniel Reeves would either save Baker Company or destroy his military career, possibly both. Dawn broke misty and cool over the Norman countryside on June 14th, 1944. Daniel Reeves and Frank Kowalski had moved into position well before first light, climbing through the pre-dawn darkness to the partially collapsed attic of an abandoned stone farmhouse that offered a commanding view over several interconnected fields and a crucial crossroads. Their mission, as briefed the previous evening by Captain William Hayes, was straightforward. Provide overwatch for Baker Company's advance along the main road, eliminate German observers in machine gun positions, standard sniper doctrine, nothing complicated. Our armor support is limited to 3 Shermans, Captain Hayes had said during the briefing, his finger tracing the route on a worn map. Intelligence suggests at least 1 enemy tank in the area, possibly more. Tank destroyer support is committed elsewhere. We're on our own for this push. Then Hayes had looked directly at the assembled sniper teams, his expression hard. Snipers will focus exclusively on infantry targets, officers, radio operators, machine gunners. Leave any armor to the bazookas and our own tanks. That's an order. Clear, crystal clear. Sir Daniel had responded along with the others. But now settling into the dusty farmhouse attic as morning light filtered through broken roof tiles, Daniel placed his equipment with deliberate care. His M1903 Springfield A4 rifle, 20 rounds of 30-06 ammunition, binoculars, radio, canteen, and 1 small tin cup filled with water he had collected from a shell crater mixed carefully with Norman clay until the consistency matched what he had tested 100 times in England. "I don't like this position," Frank whispered as he arranged his spotting scope. "Too obvious. If Germans spot movement up here, their artillery will turn this farmhouse into rubble." "That's why we're not moving much," Daniel replied quietly. He positioned the tin cup beside his rifle within easy reach, just observing, calling threats, doing our job. Frank noticed the mud-filled cup, but said nothing. He knew what it meant. He had watched Daniel practice with that cup for months. They both understood that today might be different from every other day. Today, Daniel might cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Through his binoculars, Frank scanned the landscape coming alive with early morning light. Baker Company moving up now, right on schedule, 3 Shermans spaced among the infantry. Daniel observed the American advance. Infantry moving cautiously along the sunken road, using the hedgerows for cover. The 3 Sherman tanks positioned at intervals, their crews visible through open hatches. Young men probably from farms and small towns across America, boys who should be playing baseball or working in hardware stores, now advancing into terrain that had already swallowed too many of their brothers. The morning mist hung in the hollows between hedgerows, giving the battlefield an eerily beautiful quality that belied the death waiting within the ancient vegetation. Birdsong carried across the fields. Somewhere, a cow lowed, oblivious to the men preparing to kill each other across her pasture. The radio crackled with routine communications as the advance proceeded smoothly. Too smoothly, Daniel thought. The Germans had learned to let Americans advance part way before springing their traps. Patience was a weapon, and the Germans wielded it expertly in this hedgerow country. Daniel continued his methodical scan of the terrain ahead of Baker Company's route. 800 yards northeast, he noticed something, a subtle disruption in the foliage atop a distant hedgerow, a small section where the leaves moved slightly differently than those stirred by the light morning breeze. Contact possible, he whispered. Hedgerow, 800 yards northeast. Something's there. Frank trained his binoculars on the area. I don't see anything. Wait, he adjusted focus. You're right. Disturbed vegetation. Could be an observation post. Then a flash of morning sunlight reflecting off metal binoculars. And beneath them, partially visible for just a moment, the distinctive outline of a German tank commander's cap. Tank Commander Daniel confirmed quietly, his voice steady despite his accelerating heartbeat. Panzer using the hedgerow as cover. He's got a perfect angle on that road junction where our Shermans will pass. Frank was already reaching for the radio. Should I call it in? Not yet. We need to confirm the threat first. As if answering Daniel's caution, the distant sound of grinding metal reached them across the fields, the unmistakable sound of a tank traversing its turret, bringing its main gun to bear on a new target. Daniel caught another brief glimpse of the tank commander, now standing higher in his hatch hand signals, directing his gunner toward the approaching American column, still unaware of the threat. Okay, call it now, Daniel said. Frank keyed the radio. Baker 6. This is Overwatch 2. Possible armor threat vicinity grid, coordinate Delta 47. Commander visible. Vehicle hull down behind northeast hedgerow. Over. The response came back immediately, the radio operator's voice, professional and unconcerned. Overwatch 2, hold position and continue observation. Will relay to armor. Maintain focus on infantry targets. Out. Daniel watched as the minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. The lead Sherman tank and its accompanying infantry continued their steady advance, now less than 500 yards from the hidden Panzer's optimal firing position. There was no indication the warning had reached them, no change in movement patterns, no defensive positioning. They're not stopping, Frank whispered urgently. Should we try again? Before Daniel could answer, a second German tank commander appeared briefly above a different section of the same hedgerow, approximately 30 yards left of the first position. Then a third commander further left still. 3 separate panzers in coordinated ambush positions, waiting for the Americans to advance into the kill zone. Jesus Christ, Frank breathed. 3 panzers. Our guys are walking right into a slaughter. He was back on the radio immediately, his voice more insistent now. Baker 6, Overwatch 2, updated contact. 3 panzers, repeat, 3 enemy tanks in ambush formation, coordinates Delta 47 through Delta 52. Sherman element entering kill zone. Request immediate halt and maneuver. Over. The response was the same maddeningly calm voice. Overwatch 2 information relayed. Continue mission. Out. But the Shermans weren't changing course. They weren't taking defensive positions. Either the warning hadn't reached the tank commanders or the communication had broken down in the chaos of coordinating multiple units across compartmentalized terrain. Radio communication in the bocage was notoriously unreliable signals, blocked by the dense vegetation and earthen walls. Daniel watched the lead Sherman approach the fatal intersection. The German tank commanders were now more frequently visible, coordinating their ambush with hand signals and brief radio communications. In less than 2 minutes, maybe 90 seconds, the killing would begin. 3 American Shermans trapped in a narrow lane between hedgerows. 3 German panzers in prepared positions with clear fields of fire. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Range 820 yards to first commander, Daniel said quietly, making minute adjustments to his scope. Wind negligible. Morning sun directly behind us at approximately 45 degrees. Danny, what are you doing? Frank hissed. Captain Hayes couldn't have been more direct. We're not engaging armor, Daniel replied, his eye fixed to the scope, watching the German commander through magnified glass. Just the commander, the man, not the tank. That's not the mission. That's not what we were ordered to do. If those Shermans hit that intersection without warning, we'll lose all 3 tanks and probably half the infantry company. 30, maybe 40 Americans dead in the next 2 minutes. Frank grabbed Daniel's shoulder. And if you take that shot, if you directly disobey Captain Hayes' explicit orders, they'll court-martial you. Danny, they could execute you for disobeying orders in combat. This isn't a game. Daniel's mind raced through the options. The Panzer commanders were visible only intermittently and partially, never long enough for a clean shot at this range under normal circumstances. Even if he could hit one, the others would immediately button up their hatches and still execute their ambush from the safety of closed tanks. He needed something more than just good shooting. He needed to create an opportunity where none existed. That's when he remembered the sun position. Almost directly behind their farmhouse position, its rays streaming through the broken attic window at his back, the German tankers scanning toward the American advance would be looking almost directly into that low morning sun. Their eyes already stressed by the glare, their vision already compromised. I need to try something, Daniel whispered, reaching for the tin cup of muddy water beside him. What are you doing? Frank asked, though he already knew the answer. Creating an opportunity. Daniel angled the small cup carefully, watching as the morning sunlight caught its surface. The muddy water reflected the light in a diffuse beam rather than a sharp mirror flash. By subtly adjusting the cup's position with tiny movements of his wrist, he could direct the reflection towards specific points. The beam of light, softened by the suspended clay particles, traveled across 800 yards of Norman countryside and splashed across the hedgerow where the first Panzer commander stood partially exposed. Daniel saw the German officer react immediately. The man squinted against the unexpected light, raised one hand to shade his eyes, and instinctively stood slightly higher in his hatch to get a better view of what was causing the strange glow. For a crucial 2 seconds, perhaps 3, the man's entire torso was exposed above the hedgerow, his chest and shoulders clear in Daniel's scope. Daniel exhaled slowly, emptying his lungs completely. His finger took up the slack in the trigger. The crosshairs settled on the German's chest. The world narrowed to just the scope's view, the feel of the rifle against his shoulder, the controlled pause between heartbeats. The Springfield cracked its report, echoing across the Norman countryside like a crack of thunder in the morning stillness. 800 yards away, traveling at 2,700 feet per second, the 30-06 round took 1.2 seconds to reach its target. Daniel watched the German officer's body jerk violently backward, then slump forward, half out of the hatch, arms dangling lifelessly. Confusion erupted inside the Panzer. Daniel could see crew members below, reaching up frantically, trying to pull their commander's body back inside the tank, their training and discipline momentarily shattered by the sudden death of their leader. "Target down," Daniel said calmly, already working the rifle's bolt to chamber another round. The spent brass casing ejected in a glittering arc, landing on the dusty attic floor with a metallic ping. "Radio Baker Company, tell them precise location of Panzer threat. Commander neutralized, but vehicle still operational." 2 more tanks in the same hedgerow. Frank stared at him for a long moment, stunned by what had just happened. Then he grabbed the radio with shaking hands. "Baker 6 Overwatch 2. Enemy armor confirmed. Repeat confirmed. Delta 47. Commander neutralized, but vehicle still operational. Recommend immediate evasive action. 2 additional Panzers, same vicinity. Over." This time the response was immediate and different. The urgency in the radio operator's voice had changed completely. "Overwatch 2, say again, Commander neutralized. How, what assets engaged over?" "Sniper engagement," Frank replied, glancing at Daniel, who was already repositioning his mud cup for the second shot. "Threat confirmed. Advise Sherman element. Take defensive positions immediately. Over." Through his binoculars, Frank saw the lead Sherman abruptly halt, then reverse rapidly into a concealing dip in the road. The infantry scattered immediately to defensive positions along the adjacent hedgerow, taking cover behind the earthen walls that had been built centuries before to divide Norman farmland. They got the message, Frank confirmed. "But Danny, you just violated direct orders. Captain Hayes was explicit. You engaged armor." Daniel was already angling his cup of muddy water again, directing another calculated reflection toward the 2nd Panzer position, where the commander was now clearly visible, standing higher in his hatch, trying to understand what had just happened to his neighboring tank. Sometimes, Daniel said quietly, his voice utterly calm, "you have to choose between following orders and doing what's right." The morning sun caught the muddy water surface again. The diffuse reflection traveled 800 yards. The 2nd German commander, already stressed and confused by the sudden death of his comrade, raised his binoculars toward the source of the strange light. For a brief moment, seeking to identify the threat, he exposed himself completely. The Springfield cracked again. The morning of June 14th unfolded into one of the most remarkable displays of adapted sniper tactics in the European theater. After the first 2 Panzer commanders fell to Daniel's rifle, the situation rapidly evolved into a deadly game of patience and precision across the Norman hedgerows. The German tanks, suddenly deprived of leadership and coordination, attempted to regroup and identify the threat they faced. A 3rd Panzer commander, positioned approximately 900 yards distant in a supporting position, emerged more fully from his hatch to get a better view of the situation unfolding with his companion tanks. Daniel's technique worked again. A brief, calculated flash of light from the angled cup drew the Germans' attention directly toward the farmhouse. The momentary distraction and the commander's slight repositioning to see better provided just enough exposure. The range was longer, the wind had picked up slightly, but Daniel's calculations were precise. 3 commanders down, Daniel reported, calmly working the bolt on his rifle with practiced efficiency. The 3rd brass casing joined the others on the floor, but they'll adapt quickly. They're not stupid. Frank, having moved past his initial shock at Daniel's decision to engage the tank commanders, was now fully committed to supporting whatever Daniel intended to do. He had made his choice back at Camp Lejeune when Daniel saved his life. Where Daniel went, Frank followed. Loyalty transcended orders. "New target," Frank called out, his eyes pressed to his spotting scope. "Panzer moving position. Looks like a Panzer IV trying to relocate through that gap between hedgerows. Range approximately 750 yards." Commander necessarily exposed to direct the driver through the narrow passage, Daniel swung his rifle smoothly to the new position. The angle was wrong for his reflection technique from their current position. The sun was behind them, but the target was too far to the side. The commander was visible, but moving erratically as the tank navigated difficult terrain, the driver unable to see clearly and dependent entirely on the commander's shouted directions. No reflection needed. Daniel murmured to himself, tracking the moving target. Just patience and timing. He waited, breathing steady, heart rate controlled through years of hunting experience. The German commander stood fully upright now, leaning out of the hatch, shouting directions to his driver as the massive Panzer attempted to squeeze between ancient hedgerows never designed for vehicles of such size. The Springfield's report echoed again. Daniel watched the German officer clutch his chest and fall backward into the tank, disappearing from view. The Panzer, suddenly without guidance, lurched forward blindly and crashed into a hedgerow, its tracks churning earth and roots as the panicked driver tried to understand why his commander had stopped shouting directions. 4 down, Daniel said quietly. By this time, the American forces had recognized the opportunity created by Daniel's unexpected intervention. A radio message crackled through on their frequency. Overwatch 2, this is Baker 6. Continue your engagement if possible. Tank destroyer support still delayed at least 20 minutes. You're preventing a massacre. Whatever you're doing up there, keep doing it. Out. The implied permission to continue, despite the earlier explicit orders, came as a relief to both men. What had begun as a single act of battlefield initiative was transforming into something larger, something that might change how the entire Bocage campaign was fought. Frank looked at Daniel with something approaching awe. Danny, you just got permission to keep breaking the rules. I don't think that's exactly what he said. That's exactly what he said. Keep shooting tank commanders. You've got official approval now. From the same officer who explicitly ordered me not to engage armor 6 hours ago. War makes strange bedfellows, Frank said with a slight grin despite the tension. Or in this case, war makes officers swallow their doctrine when farm boys prove them wrong. Over the next 3 hours, the deadly pattern continued. German Panzer units accustomed to operating with near impunity behind the Bocage hedgerows suddenly found themselves vulnerable in ways they hadn't anticipated. Their entire tactical doctrine in this terrain depended on tank commanders directing operations from open hatches. The restricted visibility through periscopes made effective combat nearly impossible in the compartmentalized Bocage landscape. Commanders had to expose themselves. It was necessary. It had always been safe because snipers targeted infantry, not armor. Until today. Until one Nebraska farm boy decided the manual was wrong. Daniel's technique evolved as the morning progressed, becoming more refined with each engagement. He varied the duration of his light flashes, sometimes a quick flicker lasting only a second to draw initial attention, sometimes a steady beam held for 3 or 4 seconds to momentarily dazzle or disorient the target. He even incorporated Frank's polished steel compass mirror as an alternative reflector when angles required it. The combination of multiple reflective surfaces used from slightly different positions within the farmhouse attic created confusion among the German tankers about where exactly the light was coming from. By mid-morning, word of the mysterious sniper taking out Panzer commanders had spread among American units in the sector. Forward observers began deliberately calling in tank locations to Daniel's position, treating him less like a sniper team and more like a specialized anti-armor asset. The local tactical situation had transformed dramatically. German armor no longer moved with the impunity they had enjoyed for the previous week. Their remaining vehicles were forced to operate with hatches closed, severely restricting their combat effectiveness in terrain that already limited visibility to dangerous levels. The psychological impact on German forces became increasingly evident as morning turned toward afternoon. Radio intercepts translated hastily by battalion intelligence officers revealed growing confusion and concern among Panzer unit commanders. One intercepted message from a Panzer company commander to his battalion headquarters was particularly revealing. Unknown American weapon system targeting commanders exclusively. The German officer reported his voice tense even through the crackling radio static and hurried translation. 4 confirmed killed this sector in past 2 hours. Possibly optical aiming device or directed energy system. Cannot identify source. Request immediate air reconnaissance of area. Cannot operate effectively with all hatches closed. Visibility too restricted for this terrain. Request permission to withdraw and regroup. The German response was predictable and by the book. Permission denied. Hold positions. Artillery assets will target suspected sniper positions. Infantry sweep will follow. Daniel and Frank heard the translation over their radio link to battalion intelligence. The German response told them 2 things. First, the enemy had no idea what was actually killing their tank commanders. They thought it was some kind of advanced weapon system, which played perfectly into Allied intelligence goals of keeping the Germans off balance and uncertain. Second, artillery was coming. Time to move, Frank said, as the first ranging shots began falling 200 yards from their position. German artillery trying to bracket the farmhouse. Daniel nodded, carefully packing his essential equipment. The tin cup of muddy water went into his pack with the same care he gave his rifle and ammunition. That cup had become as important as any weapon he carried, more important perhaps because it created opportunities that the rifle merely exploited. The southeast corner of the orchard gives us good angle on the eastern approaches, Daniel suggested as they hurriedly descended the rickety farmhouse stairs. Stone walls there will provide better protection against artillery fragments, too. They relocated 3 times over the afternoon, always staying one position ahead of German counterfire. Each time they moved, Daniel set up his reflection system again, the tin cup with its muddy water, Frank's compass mirror, and eventually a small shard of mirror glass salvaged from the farmhouse bathroom, creating three separate reflective surfaces that could be used individually or in combination to create different effects. By using multiple reflectors positioned at slightly different angles, they could create momentary light displays from different directions, thoroughly confusing the German tankers about the true location of the threat they faced. The Germans knew generally that danger came from the American lines, but the specific source remained maddeningly elusive. As the afternoon wore on, the psychological advantage grew exponentially. German tank units became increasingly hesitant to advance or even to reposition. Those that did move did so with commanders fully buttoned up inside their vehicles, which severely limited their tactical awareness and combat effectiveness. This created opportunities for American bazooka teams to approach much closer than would normally be possible, resulting in several additional Panzer kills from conventional anti-tank weapons. The combined effect of Daniel's sniper operations and the conventional anti-tank efforts had eliminated or disabled 19 German armored vehicles from the battlefield by late afternoon, an unprecedented achievement that transformed what had been planned as a minor limited objective advance into a significant breakthrough in the entire sector. Baker Company, supported by units on their flanks, who had heard about the mysterious sniper and requested similar support, advanced further in one day than they had managed in the previous week combined. Key crossroads were secured, forward observation positions established. The Germans, confused and demoralized by a threat they couldn't identify or counter, withdrew to secondary defensive lines to regroup and reassess. The final Panzer commander fell at 16:23 hours when Daniel, now operating from a shallow drainage ditch alongside a sunken road, created a complex triple reflection using all three of his reflective surfaces simultaneously. Three beams of diffused light from three slightly different angles converging on the position where a veteran German tank commander was attempting to direct a fighting withdrawal. The disoriented officer, desperately trying to locate the source of the bewildering light display while simultaneously commanding his tank's retrograde movement, exposed himself just long enough, just those critical 2 seconds that Daniel had learned to exploit through months of practice and a morning of deadly refinement. The 19th shot, the 19th Panzer commander. The 19th precisely aimed bullet from a Nebraska farm boy who understood light better than any military manual. As the sun began its descent toward the Norman horizon, the remaining German armor in the sector withdrew completely to regroup, allowing American forces to secure several key objectives that had been contested unsuccessfully for days. What had begun that morning as a single act of battlefield initiative, one soldier's controversial decision to disobey explicit orders when the situation demanded it, had evolved into a tactical innovation that would soon be studied and replicated throughout the Allied forces in Normandy. Baker Company's advance, which had started with such uncertain prospects in the morning mist, concluded with the secure occupation of three critical crossroads and a forward observation post that provided clear visibility over German positions extending toward St. Lo. The day's objectives, considered optimistic by battalion planners, had been exceeded. Casualties, expected to be heavy based on previous Bocage fighting, were remarkably light. 3 Americans wounded, none killed, a miracle by Bocage standards. Captain William Hayes, who had given the original explicit orders restricting sniper engagements to infantry targets, only personally made his way to Daniel's final position as darkness fell across the hedgerow country. He found Daniel sitting against a tree, his rifle across his lap, utterly exhausted. The tin cup, now empty and dried, sat beside him. 19 spent brass casings lay scattered around his position like fallen leaves. Reeves, Captain Hayes said simply, standing above the exhausted sniper. His voice was carefully neutral, revealing nothing. Daniel looked up, too tired to stand at attention. "Sir," Hayes studied him for a long moment. "I don't know whether to court-martial you or recommend you for the Silver Star." "Just doing what needed doing," Sir Daniel replied quietly. His hands moved automatically, cleaning his rifle with a cloth, even as exhaustion made his movements slow. The tin cup still sat beside him, the dried mud residue visible at the bottom like evidence at a crime scene. 19 tank commanders, Hayes said, shaking his head slowly as if still not quite believing it. "Battalion intelligence thinks you single-handedly devastated elements of 3 separate panzer companies. They're calling it the Bocage miracle at division headquarters." Frank Kowalski, who had been checking the radio equipment nearby, overheard the conversation and interjected quietly. "It wasn't a miracle, sir. It was mud in a cup and a farm boy who understood light better than the rest of us understood doctrine." Captain Hayes looked thoughtfully at the simple tin cup with its residue of dried Norman clay. "I want a full report, Reeves. Every detail of this reflection technique. Written report on my desk by tomorrow morning. This could change how we fight in this entire damned hedgerow country." Daniel nodded, too tired for words. He had fired only 19 rounds over nearly 12 hours of continuous operations. a remarkably small expenditure of ammunition for such significant battlefield impact. But the mental strain of precision shooting at extreme ranges, combined with the constant movement to avoid German counterfire, combined with the weight of knowing he had killed 19 men today, had left him utterly drained. As full darkness settled over the Norman countryside, the significance of the day's events was still being assessed by American commanders up the chain to division and corps level. What was clear, however, was that one soldier's decision to innovate, to see opportunity where doctrine saw only restrictions, had created a pivotal moment in the brutal Bocage fighting. Daniel sat against that tree long after Captain Hayes departed, the tin cup of now dried mud still clutched in his hand like a talisman. Frank brought him cold rations and coffee, sitting beside his friend in companionable silence as the stars emerged above them. "You know they'll want you to teach this to every sniper in the ETO. Now," Frank said quietly, using the abbreviation for European Theater of Operations, "not much to teach." Daniel replied, his voice barely above a whisper, "Just farm boy tricks. Using what's available. Seeing what others miss. Farm boy tricks that killed 19 Panzer commanders and broke open this entire sector." Frank corrected him. "Don't downplay what happened today, Danny. You changed something fundamental. You proved that one man thinking differently can alter the course of a battle." Daniel looked at the tin cup in his hand, at the dried mud that had reflected morning sunlight and created opportunities where none had existed. He thought about the 19 German soldiers he had killed today, young men probably with families, definitely with names and stories and futures that would never happen now. The weight of that sat heavy in his chest. But he also thought about the Sherman crews who had made it through the day alive, the infantry who had advanced without being caught in a Panzer ambush. The objectives secured, the breakthrough achieved, the scales didn't balance cleanly, they never would. But the mathematics were clear. 19 enemy deaths had prevented perhaps 50 or 60 American deaths, maybe more. As the stars emerged above the ancient Norman landscape, neither man could have fully comprehended just how far the ripples of this day would spread, how the technique of using reflected light to create shooting opportunities would be taught to Allied snipers across the entire European theater, how German armor doctrine would be forced to adapt, how a tin cup in muddy water would be studied in military academies decades later as an example of battlefield innovation. But on the evening of June 14th, Daniel simply cleaned his rifle one more time, checked his remaining ammunition, 15 rounds left from the 35 he had carried into position that morning, and allowed himself to finally rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new orders, possibly a court-martial, possibly a medal, possibly both. Tonight he had done what he set out to do. He had saved American lives using nothing but observation, adaptation, and the willingness to trust his own judgment when doctrine failed. The Nebraska farm boy who understood light had changed warfare. The manual would have to be rewritten. And somewhere in the darkness in German headquarters, miles away, intelligence officers were frantically trying to identify the mysterious American weapon system that had decimated their panzer forces. They would never discover the truth until after the war ended, that the feared Geheimwaffe, the secret weapon that had terrorized their tank commanders, was nothing more than sunlight mud and a soldier who refused to let doctrine prevent him from doing what was right. 24 hours after Daniel Reeves killed 19 Panzer commanders with a tin cup in muddy water, he expected to be summoned for court-martial proceedings. Instead, he found himself standing at attention in the command tent of the 29th Infantry Division headquarters, surrounded by officers whose combined rank insignia could have filled a display case. Major General Charles Gerhardt, the division commander himself, sat behind a field desk, studying a collection of items spread before him. Daniel's written report, the tin cup still stained with dried Norman clay, 19 spent brass casings arranged in a neat row, and a series of radio transcripts documenting the previous day's engagement. "At ease, Private Reeves," Gerhardt said without looking up from the documents. Daniel relaxed slightly but remained standing. Beside the general sat Colonel Sidney Bingham from Division Intelligence, a captain from the Army Corps of Engineers, and Major Arthur Winterbourne, a British liaison officer from 21st Army Group Headquarters. All of them were studying Daniel like he was a specimen under glass. Frank Kowalski stood outside the tent, having been dismissed after giving his own account of the day's events. Before leaving, Frank had whispered to Daniel, "If they court-martial you, I'm testifying that I helped. We go down together." But the atmosphere inside the tent didn't feel like a court-martial. It felt like something else entirely. General Gerhardt finally looked up, his weathered face unreadable. "Private Reeves, you're not here for disciplinary action. You're here because you've accomplished something unprecedented in this theater. You've broken a German armored defense using a technique that costs nothing, requires no special equipment, and can potentially be taught to every sniper we have. We need to understand exactly what you did and how it can be replicated." The debriefing lasted 3 hours. Daniel explained his technique in exhaustive detail. The consistency of muddy water that created optimal diffuse reflection, the angles required based on sun position, the timing sequences that drew enemy attention without revealing exact source locations, the psychological principles of human curiosity and distraction that made the technique effective. He demonstrated with the same tin cup, showing how slight adjustments in angle could direct reflected light with surprising precision, how multiple reflectors used in coordination created confusion about threat location, how the technique worked best against targets who needed to expose themselves for operational reasons, like tank commanders directing their crews through restricted terrain. Extraordinary Major Winterbourne observed in his crisp British accent. Reminds one of Lawrence in Arabia using mirrors for signaling but weaponized for precision targeting. Elegant simplicity. The engineering captain leaned forward, fascinated. The beauty of it is the zero industrial footprint. Every soldier has a canteen. Every battlefield has mud and water. It's infinitely reproducible with no supply chain requirements, no factory production, no shipping priorities, just training and implementation. Colonel Bingham from intelligence had a different perspective. The psychological impact may be as valuable as the tactical application. Captured German documents from yesterday reference a Geheimwaffe, a secret weapon. They believe we've deployed some kind of advanced optical targeting system. The confusion and fear this creates in their armor units is significant. They're wasting resources trying to identify and counter technology that doesn't exist. General Gerhardt set down the report and looked directly at Daniel. Can you teach this technique, Reeves, sir? There's not much to teach. It's just understanding how light works and using environmental resources. Any soldier with basic observation skills could learn it. Most men don't think the way you think, Private. Most men follow doctrine because that's what keeps them alive in chaos. You improvise because you saw doctrine failing. That's not common. But the technique itself, once demonstrated, seems teachable. Gerhardt made a decision. Starting tomorrow, you'll train every sniper team in this division on your reflection method. We'll document it properly, create a technical bulletin, distribute it theater-wide. This innovation came from the field, from an enlisted man who saw a problem and created a solution. The Army needs to recognize that and leverage it. Then the general's expression grew more serious. However, we have a complication. You directly disobeyed explicit orders from your company commander. Captain Hayes had ordered all sniper teams to avoid engaging armor. You violated that order 19 times in one day. Yes, sir, Daniel acknowledged. I understand the violation. Captain Hayes has filed a report acknowledging the order was given and subsequently violated. However, he's also recommended you for the Silver Star for your actions. So we have a situation where the same officer wants to document your insubordination and decorate you for heroism. It's complicated. The British liaison officer spoke up. If I may, General. In the British Army, we have a saying, rules exist to guide the wise and bind the foolish. Private Reeves demonstrated wisdom in recognizing when adherence to doctrine would result in unnecessary casualties. His judgment, while technically insubordinate, saved American lives and achieved battlefield success. Surely that merits recognition rather than punishment. Gerhardt nodded slowly. I'm inclined to agree. Here's my decision. Bronze Star with V, device for valor, not Silver Star. The citation will emphasize field innovation and tactical success while carefully avoiding direct mention of disobeying orders. It acknowledges exceptional performance without setting a precedent that insubordination is acceptable. The Bronze Star, awarded in June 1944 for the June 14th action, would later be upgraded to the Silver Star in October after the technique's widespread adoption demonstrated its strategic significance. Clear, yes, Sir Daniel responded. And Reeves, one more thing. Gerhardt's voice softened slightly. I read your background file. Depression-era Nebraska, feeding your family as a child, your father's war service. You didn't learn this in any school or training program. You learned it surviving hardship. The Army is realizing that sometimes the best innovations come from soldiers who learn to improvise long before they put on a uniform, just doing what needed doing, Sir Daniel said quietly. That's what the best soldiers always say, the general replied, dismissed. Over the next 5 days, Daniel trained 63 sniper teams from across the 29th Infantry Division in his reflection technique. Word spread quickly. British sniper teams from the 50th Division requested cross-training. Canadian units from the 3rd Division sent observers. Within a week, the technique that had been born from Depression-era necessity and months of unauthorized experimentation was becoming standardized doctrine. The training sessions were remarkably simple. Daniel would demonstrate the optimal mud-to-water ratio, show how to angle reflective surfaces based on sun position, explain the psychological principles that made targets expose themselves. Most importantly, he emphasized adaptability. The technique worked because it created opportunities, but the sniper still needed skill, judgment, and patience to exploit those opportunities. One trainee, a sergeant named Willis from Alabama, watched Daniel's demonstration and shook his head in amazement. They teach us 100 ways to kill in sniper school. Nobody ever taught us to use sunlight as a weapon. That's because you can't put sunlight in a manual, Daniel replied. You have to understand it. Watch how light moves. Observe how people react to unexpected stimuli. The technique is just applying those observations. By June 19th, a hastily produced technical bulletin was distributed throughout Allied sniper units in Normandy. Technical Bulletin 44-87, Reflection Techniques for Anti anti-armor sniping operations, the official documentation of what troops were already calling the Reeves method, or simply mudlight. The bulletin detailed optimal procedures, provided diagrams of reflection angles, discussed German countermeasures that had been observed, and offered guidelines for improvisational variations based on terrain and conditions. Within 2 weeks, the technique was being employed across the Normandy front by American, British, and Canadian forces. The results were significant. British sniper teams in the eastern sector developed a variation using multiple coordinated reflectors, creating triangulated confusion that made source location nearly impossible for German commanders. 3 snipers working together could create such bewildering light patterns that Panzer commanders desperately trying to identify the threat exposed themselves for dangerously long periods. Canadian forces integrated the reflection technique with aggressive close assault tactics. They used the light to blind Panzer optics during bazooka team approaches, creating critical seconds of disorientation that allowed anti-tank teams to close distance and achieve kills from positions that would normally be suicidal. By early July, the technique was credited with contributing to 47 additional Panzer commander casualties across the Normandy sector. More significantly, it had forced a doctrinal change in German armor operations. Wehrmacht tank commanders now operated with hatches closed as standard procedure, only exposing themselves when absolutely operationally necessary. This restriction directly reduced German tactical effectiveness in the already difficult Bocage terrain. The psychological impact spread like ripples in a pond. German armor crews began reporting that they felt constantly watched, that American snipers could strike anywhere, that the mysterious light weapon made no sound and gave no warning before death arrived. Morale in Panzer units operating in Normandy declined, measurably documented in intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations. Allied intelligence officers deliberately encouraged the confusion, spreading disinformation about advanced American optical weapons programs, leaked documents suggesting experimental directed energy systems, carefully planted rumors about secret research facilities. The Germans wasted countless man-hours and significant resources investigating a technological threat that was actually just mud water and sunlight. One captured German intelligence report from mid-July, translated by Allied analysts, revealed the depth of enemy confusion. American light-based targeting system remains unidentified despite extensive investigation. Recommend all armor operations avoid prolonged stationary positions and minimize commander exposure until effective countermeasure developed. Current defensive measures, welding goggles, and helmet visor extensions provide insufficient protection. System appears capable of targeting through optical countermeasures. Daniel's reaction when shown the translation was characteristically understated. They're overthinking it, making it more complicated than it is. That's the advantage of straightforward solutions. People assume complexity and miss the obvious truth. For Daniel personally, the summer of 1944 continued with a mixture of combat training duties and the growing recognition that he had changed something fundamental about warfare. He returned to frontline sniper operations in late July, now paired with a new spotter after Frank Kowalski was temporarily reassigned to help train additional sniper teams in the reflection technique. His new spotter was Corporal Eugene Martinez, a quiet Mexican-American kid from Texas with sharp eyes and unshakable calm under fire. Martinez had heard the stories about the farm boy who killed 19 Panzers in one day and was initially skeptical. Farm boy luck, he had said dismissively to other soldiers. That skepticism lasted exactly one mission. Watching Daniel work, seeing the methodical preparation, the careful observation, the precise execution, Martinez understood this wasn't luck. This was skill refined through necessity and applied with deadly effectiveness. You really can see light differently than other people, Martinez observed after their third mission together. It's not just a technique, it's how you perceive the environment. That's not teachable from a manual. My father used to say, everyone sees the same light, Daniel replied quietly. The difference is whether you understand what you're seeing. Most people just look. I learned to observe. Depression taught me that. Miss what you're looking at, go hungry. Operation Cobra, the massive Allied breakout from Normandy, launched on July 25th. Daniel's reflection technique, now employed by dozens of trained sniper teams across the front, contributed to the operation's success by degrading German armor effectiveness at critical moments. Panzer commanders forced to operate buttoned up or risk the mysterious American light weapons suffered reduced situational awareness that compromised their tactical responses. By September 1944, when Allied forces reached the German border, Daniel's official confirmed kill count stood at 63, with 27 of those being tank commanders or vehicle crew operators, an extraordinary number that reflected both his skill and the effectiveness of his innovative technique. In October, Daniel received his Silver Star upgraded from the Bronze Star after Captain Hayes and other officers submitted additional supporting documentation emphasizing the technique's widespread adoption and significant battlefield impact. The award ceremony was brief, conducted in a muddy field in Belgium. General Gerhardt pinned the medal on Daniel's uniform and said simply, "You've given the Army something it desperately needed, permission to think differently." The citation specifically mentioned how his methods had become standard doctrine, saving countless Allied lives and degrading enemy armor effectiveness throughout the European theater. It was carefully worded to praise innovation while avoiding direct reference to the initial disobedience that had sparked everything. Daniel sent the medal home to his father with a short letter. "Dad, remember that mirror you gave me? It broke. In France, stopped shrapnel that would have killed me. But even broken, it kept working. Became part of something that changed how we fight. Maybe that's the lesson. Sometimes the most useful things are the ones that break and become something new. Coming home soon. Love, Daniel." The war continued. The Battle of the Bulge in December tested Daniel's skills in winter conditions where his reflection technique was harder to employ effectively. Snow changed how light moved. Overcast skies eliminated many opportunities. But he adapted using reflected muzzle flash from friendly artillery, using the brief glint of ice formations, finding new ways to create the momentary distractions that generated opportunities. At St. Vith in Belgium, during desperate defensive fighting, Daniel used his technique against German Sturmgeschütz assault guns threatening American positions. 6 self-propelled gun commanders fell to his rifle over 2 days of intense combat. The Silver Star citation had mentioned tactical innovation. This was tactical necessity, adaptation in chaos, survival through applied intelligence. Victory in Europe came in May 1945. Daniel Reeves survived the entire war without serious injury, returning home to Nebraska in July with his medals, his M1903 rifle that the Army allowed him to purchase, and the dented tin cup that had started everything. The cup was empty now, the Norman clay long since washed away, but Daniel kept it as a reminder. North Platte welcomed him home with a small ceremony at the train station. His father, John, now 70, embraced him silently. Ellen Hartley, who had waited through 4 years of war and countless anxious letters, cried when she saw him step off the train in his uniform with the Silver Star ribbon on his chest. They married in September 1945 in the same church where Daniel's parents had married 25 years earlier. The wedding was simple, attended by family and friends who had known Daniel as the quiet hardware store clerk who went to war and came back different, not broken, just changed, aged beyond his 25 years by things he rarely discussed. Daniel used his GI Bill benefits to purchase 160 acres of farmland not far from his childhood home. Good wheat land, similar to what his father had worked. He farmed in the mornings, worked occasionally at the hardware store in afternoons, and built a life that looked from the outside like he had never left Nebraska at all. But he had changed. Anyone who knew him before the war could see it. He was quieter, more thoughtful. He would sometimes stop mid-conversation and stare at how sunlight hit morning dew, lost in thoughts he never fully explained. Ellen understood. She didn't press. Some things soldiers carried home couldn't be spoken, only lived with. Daniel occasionally spoke at the local school when teachers asked him to discuss the war. He never talked about killing, never mentioned the 19 Panzer commanders or the 63 total confirmed kills. Instead, he talked about problem solving, about seeing challenges differently, about how sometimes the answer isn't in the book, it's in observing what's actually in front of you. One talk he gave to high school students in 1952 captured his philosophy. "They asked me what I learned in the war," Daniel said, standing in front of 30 teenagers who saw him as a hero and didn't understand the weight of that word. "I learned that manuals are written by smart people who did their best to prepare you. But no manual covers everything. Real life is messy and complicated and different from what anyone planned." He picked up a glass of water from the teacher's desk. "This is just water in a glass. But what if I need it to be more than that? What if I need it to solve a problem the manual never anticipated? Then I have to see it differently, not just water, but reflection, not just a tool for drinking, but a tool for creating opportunity." The students didn't fully understand. That was okay. Some lessons only made sense with experience. The letters started arriving in 1948. First one, then several, then dozens over the following years. Letters from men Daniel had never met, but who owed him their lives. Tank commanders who had been in those Sherman crews advancing toward the crossroads on June 14th, 1944. Infantry who had advanced under the cover created by German armor's forced caution. Soldiers who survived because Panzer commanders stayed buttoned up, their effectiveness reduced by fear of the mysterious light weapon. The first letter came from Thomas Bennett, who had been a Sherman tank commander in Baker Company that morning in Normandy. Bennett's letter was simple and devastating in its emotional honesty. "Mr. Reeves, I don't know if you remember June 14th, 1944, but I was commanding the lead Sherman tank approaching a crossroads near Saint-Jean-de-Day when we got a radio warning about Panzers in ambush. We reversed just in time, found out later a sniper had killed the Panzer commander and called the warning Took me years to learn that sniper was you. My Sherman crew was 5 men. All 5 of us came home. We've all married, started families. My crew chief has 4 children now. My gunner has 3. I have 2. That's 14 human beings alive today because you took a shot you weren't supposed to take. There's no medal that covers what you gave us. You gave us our lives. Everything we've done since everyone we've loved, every sunset we've seen, that's all because of you. Thank you doesn't even start to cover it, but thank you anyway. Thomas Bennett, former Sergeant U.S. Army. Daniel read the letter at his kitchen table, hands shaking. Ellen found him crying, something she had never seen in their 3 years of marriage. What's wrong? She asked, concerned. Nothing's wrong, Daniel said, wiping his eyes. Everything is finally right. I never knew their names, Ellen. I saved them, but I never knew who they were. Now I know. Thomas Bennett. He named his son after me. He named his boy Daniel because I took a shot that saved his father's life. Ellen read the letter and cried too. This is what it meant, she said quietly. This is why you did what you did, not for medals or recognition, for this, for Thomas Bennett's children who exist because their father came home. More letters followed over the years, 27 letters eventually from men across America who had been in Normandy that summer, who had survived partially because one sniper changed how the battle was fought. The letters described lives lived, children born, contributions made to communities, the compound effect of survival. Each saved life, creating ripples that spread across decades. Daniel kept the letters in a wooden box his father had made, storing them beside his Silver Star medal and the dented tin cup. Occasionally he would reread them, particularly on difficult days when the memories were heavy. The letters reminded him that killing 19 men had meaning beyond the act itself. Those 19 deaths had prevented perhaps 200 American deaths. And those 200 lives had created thousands of descendants, millions of moments of joy and love and human experience. The mathematics of warfare reduced to arithmetic of grace, 19 for 200, death serving life, destruction enabling creation. In 1952, Daniel received an unexpected letter from the U.S. Army Training Command requesting his consultation on a new sniper manual being developed for Korean War deployment. They offered to fly him to Washington, all expenses paid, to meet with doctrine writers and training specialists. Daniel declined the travel, but provided a 40-page written account of his techniques, experiences, and philosophy. The document was characteristically practical and humble, filled with specific details about reflection angles and optimal mud consistency, but also with broader observations about the relationship between doctrine and adaptation. One section of his submission particularly impressed the training command officers. The manual teaches technique, Daniel wrote, but it cannot teach thinking. I learned to hunt on Nebraska plains where wasting ammunition meant your family went hungry. That pressure, that necessity taught me to see opportunities rather than wait for ideal conditions. You cannot put that kind of thinking in a manual, but you can encourage soldiers to develop it. Doctrine is the foundation. Innovation is what you build on that foundation when reality doesn't match the textbook. The training command incorporated substantial portions of Daniel's techniques into the new manual, though simplified and systematized for mass training. The reflection method became standard instruction taught to every sniper candidate. By Vietnam, it was considered fundamental sniper doctrine, its origins in a Nebraska farm boys Depression-era hunting techniques largely forgotten by most instructors. But Daniel never sought credit or recognition for the doctrine that carried his innovations. He farmed his wheat, raised 3 children with Ellen, served on the county school board, and lived a life that looked entirely unremarkable to anyone who didn't know his history. His younger brother, Tommy, who had served in the Pacific during the war, understood better than most. Tommy visited regularly, and the 2 brothers would sit on Daniel's porch in the evenings, drinking coffee and watching the sun set over wheat fields that looked exactly as they had when they were boys. You ever regret it? Tommy asked one evening in 1960, taking that shot, disobeying orders. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching light play across the wheat. Every day, he finally said, and never. I regret killing 19 men. I remember their faces through the scope, young men probably with families. They haunt me. But if I hadn't taken those shots, Thomas Bennett's children don't exist. His gunner's 3 daughters don't get born. 50 other men die that day and their children never happen. So I regret it and I don't regret it. Both are true. That's war, Tommy said quietly. Nothing clean about it, no. But maybe there's honor in accepting the weight, in not pretending it was easy or straightforward. Those 19 Germans deserve to be remembered too. They were somebody's sons. The sun set over the Nebraska plains the way it always had, the way it always would, light moving across grass and wheat with patterns that Daniel Reeves understood better than most men ever would. The Depression-era hunger that had driven him to master light's secrets was long past. But the understanding remained, and with it the memory of one day when understanding light had been the difference between disaster and survival for men he would never meet, but whose lives he had saved. Daniel Reeves died peacefully in his sleep in December 2006 at age 86. His obituary in the North Platte Telegraph was brief, mentioning his war service, his Bronze and Silver Stars, and his decades of community involvement. It noted that he was survived by Ellen, his wife of 61 years, 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and 4 great grandchildren. What the obituary couldn't capture was the legacy that spread far beyond one man's life. The technique Daniel had pioneered in Normandy remained in military sniper training manuals. Variations of his reflection method had been employed by American forces in Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, and Afghanistan. NATO countries taught the principles in their special operations courses. The fundamental concept using environmental elements to create tactical advantage had influenced military thinking beyond just sniping. Special operations units studied Daniel's story as a case example of how individual initiative and creative problem solving could achieve strategic effects. Innovation at the edge, commanders called it, trusting frontline soldiers to adapt when doctrine proved insufficient. But perhaps the most significant legacy was harder to quantify. Daniel's story, gradually becoming known as military historians researched sniper innovations of World War II, stood as proof that sometimes the most effective solutions came not from advanced technology or complex systems, but from direct observation and the willingness to see familiar things differently. A tin cup, muddy water, sunlight, things that had existed for millennia combined in a way that changed modern warfare because one man learned to see light not just as illumination but as opportunity. Frank Kowalski, who had been Daniel's spotter that day in Normandy, outlived his friend by 18 months. At Daniel's funeral, Frank gave a brief eulogy that captured something essential about the man whose life he had shared for one crucial day of history. Danny Reeves wasn't special because he could shoot, Frank said, his voice carrying across the church filled with family and friends and a surprising number of elderly veterans who had traveled to Nebraska to honor a man most of them had never met, but whose actions had rippled through their lives. Lots of men could shoot. Danny was special because he could see problems, see solutions, see what everyone else was looking at but not understanding. Frank paused, emotion thick in his voice. On June 14th, 1944, I watched him disobey direct orders to save American lives. Watched him use mud and sunlight like they were high technology. Watched him change warfare with nothing but observation and courage. That wasn't luck. That was a man who learned to see differently because the Depression taught him that missing what's in front of you has consequences. We buried him today, but his legacy lives on. Every time a soldier adapts to circumstances the manual never covered, every time someone looks at an ordinary object and sees extraordinary possibility, every time courage means trusting your own judgment when everyone else is following the book is important. But Danny taught us the book isn't everything. Reality is messier, and sometimes the farm boy who understands light saves more lives than the general who memorized doctrine. The funeral concluded with military honors. 3 soldiers in dress uniform fired a 21-gun salute. A bugler played taps. The American flag that had draped Daniel's coffin was folded with crisp precision and presented to Ellen, who accepted it with the quiet dignity she had shown throughout 61 years of marriage to a man who rarely spoke about the war but carried its weight every day. As mourners filed past the grave, Thomas Bennett, now 84 and moving slowly with a cane, stopped to place something beside the flowers. A small tin cup dented and old, filled with soil from his Virginia farm. His son, Daniel Bennett Jr., stood beside him, and his grandson, Thomas Bennett III, stood beside him. 3 generations, Thomas Bennett said quietly to Ellen, gesturing to the men beside him. 3 generations that exist because your husband saw what needed to be done and had the courage to do it. Thank you for sharing him with us. Thank you for understanding that sometimes one day in a man's life creates ripples that never stop spreading. Ellen nodded, unable to speak through tears. She understood. She had always understood. The quiet farmer she married in 1945 had been carrying the weight of those 19 deaths and those 200 saved lives for 61 years. She had watched him stare at sunlight on morning dew and known he was remembering France. She had held him through nightmares he never described. She had loved him through the complicated mixture of pride and sorrow that combat veterans carry. Now he was at rest. The weight finally lifted. The war truly over. But the legacy continued. At Fort Benning, Georgia, the Army Sniper School includes a brief historical section on innovation in sniper doctrine. Instructors show new students a photograph of a dented tin cup displayed in a glass case, and they tell the story of Private First Class Daniel Reeves, who changed warfare with mud and sunlight. The story is simplified, made into a teaching parable. Students learn the technique without always understanding its origin. But the best instructors, the ones who studied military history and understood what the story really meant, make sure students grasp the deeper lesson. The manual is your foundation, one instructor tells his class of young snipers. But the manual cannot cover every situation, cannot anticipate every terrain, every enemy, every moment when you'll have to decide between doctrine and reality. When that moment comes, you need more than technique. You need judgment, you need courage, you need the willingness to see what's in front of you and adapt. Private Reeves had that. A farm boy from Nebraska who learned to hunt during the Depression, who understood light because missing his shot meant his family starved. He took that understanding to war and used it to save lives, not through advanced technology, not through complex systems, through direct observation and the courage to trust his own eyes when everyone else was following the book. The instructor pauses, letting the lesson settle. That's what made him extraordinary, not the technique, the thinking behind it, the willingness to question doctrine when doctrine was failing, and most importantly, the moral courage to disobey orders when obeying them meant watching men die. The students listen, young men and women who will carry rifles and make life and death decisions in distant places the instructors cannot yet imagine. Some of them understand immediately. Others will understand later when they face their own moments of doctrine versus reality, but all of them will remember the story of the tin cup and the farm boy who saw light differently. And somewhere in some future conflict, one of them will face a situation the manual never covered. They will remember Daniel Reeves, and they will adapt. The legacy continues. The ripples never stop spreading. And the sun rises every morning over wheat fields in Nebraska, light moving across grass the way it always has, waiting for someone to understand what they're seeing. Daniel Reeves understood, and in understanding, he changed the world in ways both large and small, obvious and subtle, immediate and eternal. 19 Panzer commanders, 19 bullets, one tin cup of muddy water, and the truth that sometimes the most powerful weapon is seeing what everyone else misses.